Okay, I'm recording now. And so this time the subject is inflammation. And inflammation is kind of an interesting concept. It's a set of physical processes that are involved in a lot of different health related things, in basically all illness processes and injuries, and also just as a part of maintaining homeostasis in the body, maintaining balance within the body under normal circumstances. There's some of it going on. So what exactly is it? Inflammation in normal English would mean the same thing as combustion, something catching on fire, something burning. In the traditions of herbal medicine from Europe, inflammation is a cultural concept that groups together some different physical responses and processes that often show up when there's damage to the body. And so it really is, the inflammation itself is a natural process, but the grouping of these things together as inflammation is a cultural thing, and it's based on the idea of the four elements: earth, wind, fire, and water, and those being present in the body in different degrees and in balance with each other in the body. And so in this case, inflammation would be metaphorically conceived of as an excess of or a dominance of the fire element in a particular place or in a particular type of tissue within the body. And the first person that we know of that really described these set of processes this way and referred to them using this metaphor and calling them inflammation was about 2,000 years ago. He was a writer an ancient Roman writer called Celsus, and he listed a few different kind of markers or observable physical symptoms that he considered to be signs of this inflammation, this dominance of the fire element. And those were, in Latin, they're called calor, rubor, tumor, and dolor. And those mean calor is heat, rubor is redness, dolor is pain, and tumor is swelling. And so these things are all things that show up in the process of inflammation. They're not always all visible or observable. Sometimes only one of them is. And along with that, if inflammation progresses, you also sometimes one of the main symptoms that you would see of inflammation is loss of function of whatever part is inflamed. So I'm going to kind of talk about each of these a little bit and what they're like, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the physiology of inflammation and how we describe these processes in more detailed and maybe more modern terms, and then what that means for you as a student of herbal medicine, as someone who might be helping a sick person, and that sort of thing. So, inflammation is definitely something that comes up in a lot of conditions that would be appropriate to treat at home, conditions that you've undoubtedly encountered before. And if you are in any kind of a caregiving role, like taking care of children or taking care of elderly people or a partner or something like that, you've probably worked on some strategies and worked on some things to do as remedies for inflammation in the past already. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the strategies for dealing with inflammation and what to do and what not to do. So inflammation is, first of all, is a bodily process. It's not something from the outside. It's something that your body creates. It's a destructive process that your body creates in some ways, potentially destructive. And it's quite often a response to some changes or damage happening to the body. A really good, clear example of that might be if a bug bites you, a mosquito bites you, let's say, for instance. Mosquito sticks its beak into your skin, which is causing some physical damage. There's probably some enzymes, venom, whatever you want to call it, released to make the blood flow more freely. And then there is blood moving out of the blood vessels and into the tissue around them and into the mosquito. So when that happens, you get an inflammatory response, and it's usually very localized when you develop a little bug bite. And we've all had them, and we all know what they're like. They're red, they're swollen, they hurt, that sort of thing. So the first thing that everybody notices that's a big part of inflammation, and sometimes maybe even thought of as almost like a synonym for inflammation, is pain. But pain is only really part of inflammation. So this is the dolor. This is the pain. It's of course is a message that is being sent by way of your nervous system that lets you know that something has damaged you. That something, if it's a mosquito bite, it's not that much pain usually. If it's something bigger, it might be a lot more pain. Because there are more of the nerve send that kind of message, which we call pain receptors, there are more of them closer to the surface. And because of that, sometimes the severity of pain doesn't always coincide with how dangerous the injury is or anything like that. So, sometimes getting a big area of your skin scraped off, like if you fall and scrape it, might not be a life-threatening injury, but it might be extremely painful because there are a lot of these surface level receptors that are in the skin that are designed for helping you interact with your environment, that are letting you know that some damage has occurred. And so pain is a really intense sensation. Pain can result from a lot of things. It's not always part of inflammation, but when there is inflammation, the pain tends to linger. So if to cite another kind of familiar type of experience, if you're walking through the woods and you get whacked in the face with a branch, it's going to hurt at first. There's going to be this initial sting that doesn't really have anything to do with inflammation. It's just the instantaneous reaction to being hit with something. It hurts. But then there might be there might be a lingering pain that is part of inflammation, that is part of an inflammatory process, because when these pain receptors get triggered, they kind of send a message to the body that an area has been damaged, and inflammation is part of the response to that message. And that can include, in the case of getting whacked with a stick, sometimes there would be a welt that would raise, and that's swelling. That's perfusion of blood, which is likely to result in redness. Depending on how dark your skin is, that redness might be more visible or less visible, but there will be warmth that is also a result of blood and circulation rushing to the area. So pain is almost always a part of inflammation. The times when pain is not a part of inflammation is when there's something going on that's causing numbness. So you can have numbness and inflammation, but most of the time there will be pain. And if it's something more internal, like say your joints, your knees, something like that, pain might be the only thing that is actually perceivable to you. You might not have enough swelling to actually to see it or feel it. You might not have the same with heat, the same with any color changes that are happening inside your knee joint aren't going to be visible from the surface. So often the pain is the first thing to look out for. So a lingering pain that is not directly related to something that's just happened is almost always inflammation. And there is a tendency for people to want to just rush in and fix that pain right away. And I think that fixing pain without fixing what is underlying the pain, without fixing the damage, is kind of often a horrible idea, because the pain is there to keep you from damaging the area further, to kind of create an aversion to anything else coming in contact with that area that might damage it further. Or in the case of something like a knee joint, it's going to make you not want to use it as much, which can help to give it a chance to heal instead of continuing. So that's that is sometimes a strategy that people use, or a treatment choice that people make that isn't always the wisest thing to do, to try and correct pain without dealing with what's underlying it. The second one of this tetrad of symptoms that I want to talk about is the redness. The redness is maybe more properly described as perfusion of circulation, or hyperemia. It's just more blood rushing to the area. And that is part of the inflammatory process. And it's also part of it's part of the process of inflammation, and it triggers some of the other parts of inflammation. So when the mosquito bites you, blood rushes to the area, fills up the tissue, and that creates the heat and the swelling. The heat is actually because of the oxygen in the blood causing oxidation. And that's actually the same thing that would happen if something were on fire, is oxygen is combining with the stuff that's present there and causing heat. In inflammation in the body, it's, a very small amount of heat, something that you can feel as a difference with your hand maybe, but it's not going to be something where, it's going to actually cause you to smoke and sizzle. But it is a process that's very similar to combustion in some ways, an oxidation reaction that is exothermic. It's producing heat because all this oxygen-rich blood is rushing to the area. And because there's more fluid coming to the area in the form of blood, some of that fluid is getting drawn from the bloodstream, from the capillaries into the cells, and they inflate like a balloon. And what the purpose of that is to wall off anything that has been introduced into the area through the damage. So if a mosquito bites you, it's not only going to be taking some of your blood, it's going to be leaving behind some bacteria, maybe some venom, that sort of thing. So the swelling, this inflation of the cells around the damaged area that results in the little visible bump of a bug bite, or it can result in much larger areas of swelling in other scenarios, that's designed to keep anything from spreading from that area that's been introduced. It's not a perfect system. It just kind of decreases the chances that a bacteria, a virus, a poison, something like that, from whatever caused the wound, because your cells don't necessarily know it's a mosquito. They just are responding to the damage. And, it could be a needle or a thorn. It could be all kinds of things. But your body is going to respond to that with this inflammation. And if there are substances that are left behind that are proteins, it's going to respond more strongly to it. And so you'll actually get more inflammation, because as your body is walling it off and as it's having this inflammatory response, the immune system starts to attack anything that is in the area that it recognizes as an incorrect protein. And that would include a lot of venoms or pathogens or things like that, a non-human protein. So when that happens, there's often more swelling if there's something like that. And that can happen right away if it's a response to something like venom. If it's a response to a burn, it happens pretty quickly as well, because you right away have human proteins that have been altered by heat. And so the body's having an immune response to that. And if it's bacteria, it might be a very little response at first, but sometimes it becomes a much bigger response if the bacteria is proliferating, if it's making more of itself. And so then you have the body trying really hard to keep the bacteria from going anywhere, and the bacteria trying to make more and more of itself using the body resources. And sometimes that will result in a pocket of pus, which is bacteria and dead blood cells that have been used to destroy bacteria, and fluid that have been walled off from the rest of the circulatory system by this process of inflammation. So, in that case, it's actually the inflammation is working to prevent bacteria, toxins, and whatever from spreading throughout the body. It's trying to save you. It's trying to keep you from being in a worse shape because of whatever the damage is. So the perfusion of circulation, that's often first perceived as redness, change in skin color. Sometimes, quite often, it's accompanied by palpable heat, and somewhat less often, but still fairly often, it's accompanied by swelling. If you think about a sunburn, that's a totally different type of damage. It's radiation damage, but it's in that situation, it tends to be pretty widespread, much less localized than a mosquito bite. And what you get is a whole area of the skin that's been cooked a little bit, that the proteins have been altered somewhat. And then the immune system starts reacting to these altered proteins. The circulation starts perfusing through the skin tissue where they are. And you get a reddened area, which is usually not raised or swollen the way that a bug bite would be, or the way that a welt from getting whacked with a stick would be. It's usually flat, but it is hot, and sometimes it will start to peel and things like that as it goes on. And that's just kind of the body getting rid of dead cells, which is happening at the surface level by peeling, but further underneath, it's happening by cells being destroyed and metabolized. So the swelling is not always present, but when it is, and the heat is often present but not always palpable, and these are all and the change in color are all results of changes in circulation to the area, which kind of immediately follows the pain response. And it often involves that change in circulation tends to involve a change in chemistry, where certain clotting factors, are certain proteins that are used for clotting, are breaking down, and then that's triggering the release of other substances that activate the immune system and direct the immune system to bring its resources to bear in that part of the body. Does that make sense? Is that too complicated a description? I hope I'm making sense. Hang on just a second. Question about consistent inflammation, and we'll get to that in a little bit, but I don't want it to try and answer that just yet. So yeah, so that's basically the inflammation, the various different parts of the inflammation have to do with the pain, which is a nervous system signal, and the swelling, heat, and redness, which have to do with capillary perfusion and changes in circulation. So in the normal course of the human body, there's always some of this going on because all of our cells have a limited shelf life. And in some places, like the gut and like the skin, that they are changed out fairly frequently. These are areas of the body that come in contact with the surface. In other areas, I mean, the gut is considered, the inside of the gut is considered a surface because you have outside material passing over it all the time. And if you shed cells from your skin, they just go out into the environment. If you shed cells from the lining of your gut, they just end up in the stool, and they can leave the body relatively easy. Now, if you have something like bone, your bone cells don't really have anywhere to go when they're shed. So the body has to break them down one by one, hopefully, and very slowly over time, break them down and replace them as they age. So you always have cells that are kind of going around in your body looking for or responding to other cells that have started to change from age, from use or whatever, have started to wear out, and then breaking those cells down and essentially burning them up, metabolizing them. And so that's basically the same thing that's going on in inflammation, but it's at a very slow process, a very slow rate, and just kind of maintaining the homeostasis throughout your body, sort of a matter of routine maintenance. There's some processes that are just like the destructive processes in inflammation that are going on all the time, where the immune resources are being directed to a specific spot and destroying tissue that is perceived as being damaged. So that's always happening. And it's happening more in some kinds of tissue than it is in others. And, but it's happening in all kinds of tissue. It happens in brain cells. People used to think it didn't, but it does. It happens in bone cells. It happens in muscle all the time. It happens with blood cells constantly. So something a lot like inflammation is continuously going on. It involves a lot of the same signaling molecules in the body and a lot of the same processes. It doesn't add up to the point where we feel it is inflammation necessarily, or where we perceive that there is inflammation necessarily. However, that doesn't always work out that way. For example, early in our lives, our skeletal system is growing, and there's still cells being destroyed and cells being replaced, but more of them are being built than are being destroyed. And that changes in not exactly young adulthood, but fairly on in adulthood, maybe in your 30s or so. You get to a point where you've reached the maximum bone mass that you're going to have in your life. For most people, there are things that are mitigating factors here, but generally speaking. And then that starts to decline as we get older. And so sometimes, there are things like osteoarthritis that are partially resultant from that, and osteopenia, which is softening of the bone, loss of density of the bone. This sort of, and sometimes that can change someone's stature, maybe even make them shorter. And that can be perceived over time as inflammation, but it's like a slow burn rather than a fast burn. And then you have inflammatory chronic illnesses, which are really common. Most people develop more inflammation as they get older for a variety of different reasons and in a variety of different processes. So, and some of it is just, there's wear and tear on your body. And so your body is having to do more maintenance as more things wear out. There's also an idea that maybe as we get older, our cells get less good at making copies of themselves. Maybe our cells are lower quality as older people than they were when we were younger, and therefore have to be replaced more often, and that results in more inflammation. So, you know, if you're middle-aged or older, you may notice that you have more inflammation in your body just sort of at a baseline than you did when you were younger. And things like, you know, sleeping in an awkward position or getting up from being seated on the floor or something like that might be more painful. And part of the reason is just because there's more inflammation all the time than there is, you know, when you're younger. And that's just part of the homeostatic process of inflammation, of cells going around and breaking things down and replacing them, and of that having kind of, or not being in a state of balance where it can continue in perpetuity, but rather being in a state where you're aging as time goes on. And so that's one area of inflammation. One of the things that people who are health conscious might be looking to try and change about inflammation is to try and have less inflammation as they get older. And then there's also, of course, the chronic illness type inflammations, where if someone has certain types of wear and tear to their body, there will be constant inflammation. For example, if someone has heart disease, there might be inflammation in their heart all the time because their heart's struggling to keep up. If someone has any kind of organ insufficiency where the organ is struggling to keep up with its workload, there will tend to be inflammation. There's also more inflammation in people of lower socioeconomic status, and we don't know the entire, we know a lot of reasons why that's the case, but we don't really know how to quantify how much of each one it is. But some examples would be differences in body chemistry that result from food insecurity, differences in how your body is handling inflammation because of stress, which we'll get into in a little bit, and differences in what you're having to do with your body, like how much sleep you're able to get, how hard of a job you might have, things like that. So there are huge differences in the amount of inflammation in people in the same society, depending on their socioeconomic status, and essentially, you know, how cushy their life is can play a big role in that. And not only how cushy their life is now, but also what it was like when they were growing up, or even when they were gestating as a fetus, can cause lasting effects in terms of how your body processes inflammation and how much inflammation is going on in your body. If you're doing herbal medicine at a sort of supportive care type level, working with, you know, sick and slightly injured people, maybe in your family or whatever, there are a lot of specific scenarios that you're going to see and different ways that you should approach them. And one thing that you want to consider is the inflammation chronic or is it acute? In other words, is it something because of something that has just recently happened, or is it something that is because of a long running or lifelong, or maybe even just innate type of process? Something that's just how that person's body is functioning. Could reasonably think of those beings. There's sometimes inflammation is a state, and sometimes it's a trait. Sometimes it's, you know, part of how a person's body functions, and sometimes it's just something that's happening to them right now. So in cases where it's short-lived, it can be a good idea to not intervene too much, or your intervention is basically done with a view towards keeping the person comfortable rather than anything else. With long-term stuff, it might make more sense to suppress inflammation, because the inflammation can actually cause malfunction and damage if it's going on for a long time. And then in addition to that, if you're taking care of yourself and you're taking care of people around you, it's important to know about some things in diet that affect inflammation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. So with short-term inflammation type stuff, this would be things like an athletic injury, or someone hurts themselves working, something like that. A lot of the time, my first line of what I want to do about that inflammation is put heat on it. A lot of people like ice for this. I don't really like ice at all for these kind of injuries. Ice kind of became popular when it started being commercially available, when there started being ice houses and things like that, where they would save ice from the winter and have it available all year. And there was actually a book, I believe the book was called Every Man His Own Physician. It was written by a preacher named John Wesley. And he was a very influential Protestant theologian, but he was also an herbalist who believed that everyone should learn to treat themselves, and that healing should be, most of the time anyway, should be an individual thing rather than a matter for professionals. And he really made ice very popular as a treatment for injuries. He wrote about it extensively, and because he had a lot of very devout followers, a very devoted fan base, it became very popular. But it kind of does the wrong thing in my philosophy of things, in my worldview of how this works. You run the risk, if you ice an injury, you're basically numbing it. You're basically chilling those pain receptors to the point where they're not sending that message anymore. You're using the cold to constrict those blood vessels so that capillary perfusion is not happening anymore. It does relieve the pain. It does not do anything for the damage. And so it makes it so you can walk around on it and hurt yourself again, or, if it's a leg injury or something like that, you can use the part and hurt it further. And also, you often get just sort of a delayed reaction to the damage once the ice is gone, because you're not going to ice it forever. And, there's also a small possibility of doing some tissue damage by overdoing it with icing. That's more of a concern in certain situations, like if somebody doesn't have a lot of feeling in their feet to begin with, than it would be for most situations. But I really don't like icing as a treatment for injuries. I prefer heat. And that heat can be in the form of a hot compress, which would be appropriate for something like a sting or a bite. And it can also be in the form of something like a heating pad, or a heated pillow with lentils in it, or buckwheat in it, or a bag of rice or something like that, that's going to have some thermal mass that can be held on an area. And another thing that I do is a treatment called moxibustion, which is basically some burning herbs that are held near injuries, which, if you do the weekend intensive later on in this program, that we'll have a whole workshop about using moxa as applying heat to injuries. But heat for injuries, heat for minor injuries, is something that I really like, because it doesn't interfere with the process of inflammation. If anything, it speeds it up a little bit and helps get it over with faster, but it's not, and it relaxes the area around it. And so you're perceiving the heat more than you're perceiving the pain, and you're relaxing the muscles so that they're not tensing up, and you're helping the processes that your immune system is trying to do to play out faster and more efficiently. And so it tends to be good symptomatic relief without interfering with the physiological process of healing. So that's one of the first things that I like to do for that kind of a scenario. It's very good for muscle tension related pain. It's good for joint pain, lots of other things. Another thing that I would do in this scenario is, well, anti-inflammatory herbs, of course, are a lot of the time with something like that, I would try to just do a topical anti-inflammatory. If it's not very severe, if it's something that's just happened, sometimes I would put up some heat on it, and then maybe afterwards put some anti-inflammatory salve on it, which I have an anti-inflammatory salve that I make. It was actually my project when I was learning to be an herbalist. It was sort of my something that I did to show that I kind of show my work and show that I'd learned some, but I still use it. It's a wintergreen based salve, and I used a lot of it at first aid at festivals, and I've used a lot of it at rainbow gatherings and demonstrations and things like that, where there were people who I was treating who were in situations where they were likely to get minor injuries. And I can put a recipe for that in the comments when I upload this video. It's a useful thing, and it's pretty easy to make. We'll get into salve making a little bit later, and the kind of theory and practice behind it, but this is something that I use. So topical anti-inflammatories, heat, and then if it lasts for more than an hour or two, then sometimes an internal anti-inflammatory can be appropriate, or if there's a lot of swelling. And one of the nice anti-inflammatories to use for something that has just happened, for an acute inflammatory situation, is willow, which we talked about. Willow actually has a little bit of blood thinning properties, changes the consistency of the blood just a little bit. So it helps with that capillary perfusion thing, but it also decreases pain and swelling, and tends not to interfere with healing, but tends to give some relief. Ginger is another one. I much prefer ginger to willow in things that are inside the abdomen. So if it's in the digestive system, which inflammation in that area is often manifest as diarrhea, or sometimes just pain in the organs. So, and nausea also. So ginger can be really good for that. And it's warming, and it's an anti-inflammatory. And those are a couple of good herbs. There are, hundreds, but those are some strategies and some reasonably good herbs to use. Just a second. Yeah. So, yeah, sometimes, some people, ice disagrees with them more than others. Some people even get almost like an allergic reaction, urticaria, in response to it. But for everybody, I think at best it's symptomatic relief that kind of you sort of pay for with interest when you stop doing it, in terms of the inflammation in your system. Now, in longer term inflammation, there is sort of a different approach. Usually with longer term inflammation, I start out doing things internally, and I also use heat with it. Heat is good also, but a lot of the time I'm using things like ginger and turmeric internally. And willow, I usually don't use for long term. I use it for maybe up to 5 days, but not necessarily if I'm going to send somebody home with something to take for a month until they see me again. I'm not going to do willow for that. If I've got somebody that I'm taking care of at home, and they've got something like, say, osteoarthritis, where they're going to, for the foreseeable future, need to be using some kind of anti-inflammatory to help them be in less pain, I really like some more food-like anti-inflammatories. Ginger is one of them, and that I like. And turmeric is a related plant that is not spicy. Some people get along better with it than with ginger. And then I like to use antioxidant containing foods and herbs as well, which kind of brings me to the next little thing that I want to talk about, which is the really long-term inflammation, the lifelong inflammation that's just sort of part of the process of aging and of the body slowly breaking down over time. And antioxidants are good for that too. And they're good because they're because they're anti-inflammatory. So I mentioned before that, when you feel that heat from inflammation, that is actually legitimately an oxidation process that is something like burning, but happening in much slower motion with much less heat released at a time. But, similar enough that even people who didn't know anything about oxygen realized that it was a kind of an analogous process to burning. And I mean, if we perceive it as such, we perceive it as a burning sensation. So that's legit. It's actually very chemically similar to something being burned, but in slow motion. And so that's part of the process that's going on through our body all the time as we age, of inflammation causing minor damage as our cells are replaced by newer cells. So antioxidants are substances that sort of slow that process or decrease the intensity of that process. So a lot of the time you'll hear of antioxidants being promoted in supplements and maybe being spoken of as being anti-aging substances, which I really hate the word anti-aging because it makes it sound like you're not going to age. And the only way that happens is if you die, which is usually kind of not the goal. But they make it so that age doesn't take as big a toll on you as quickly, which is really pro-aging, because ideally you get older than you would if you hadn't done it. Anyway, people promote them as being anti-aging, and antioxidants are kind of a whole category of dietary supplements. If you go to a place that sells supplements, there will be all kinds of things like resveratrol and catechins from green tea and L-theanine and all sorts of other things that are promoted primarily as being antioxidants. And so basically what antioxidants are is they're really mild anti-inflammatories. They're anti-inflammatories that work through one particular process, through one particular step of the inflammatory, the chain reaction or cascade of chain reactions that are involved in inflammation. And they keep that oxidation from happening, that slow burning of the tissue from happening. And so it's good to take these things as a supplement, sure, but it's also really important to incorporate things that contain antioxidants into your diet. And this is something that I recommend for anybody that has any chronic inflammation. And it's also something that I recommend for anybody who just wants to keep their body for as long as possible and keep it in good health. So what are antioxidants? There are a lot of different ones. And usually they're kind of substances that are in the plant in some sort of a protective capacity, sort of like preservatives for the living material. Plants don't exactly have immune systems the way that we do, but antioxidants are part of how they protect themselves from damage. And so some of the common antioxidants that have had a lot of studies done on them, one of them is a substance called resveratrol. It was originally, well, I'm not sure actually where it was originally isolated from, but it's found in pine bark and it's also found in grapes. And it's a powerful antioxidant, and that's available as a supplement. But like I said, it's also in grapes. It's in a lot of other fresh foods and fruits and vegetables in varying amounts. Vitamin C is an antioxidant. It's present in fruits and vegetables, generally speaking. Most green vegetables and sour fruits contain at least some vitamin C. Oranges are kind of the thing that is highly promoted for it. Lemons and limes too. Some of the first things that people noticed contained antioxidants. If people get a deficiency of vitamin C, basically it manifests as inflammation in different tissues throughout the body. And that's what scurvy is. It's just an inflammatory process that happens because you don't have the baseline of this nutrient that you're supposed to have in your system. Not many of us are in danger of getting scurvy now, but even so, there's a big difference between the level of vitamin C that it takes to prevent scurvy and the level that would basically constitute ideal functioning. And the thing about vitamin C is if you get too much of it, it just kind of upsets your stomach. Doesn't tend to have any really severe problems. So you can take quite a bit of it if you're taking it in supplement form. I really never take it in supplement form. I just try and get it from fruits and vegetables. So that's a type of antioxidant. The oil-based vitamins like vitamin E also have some antioxidant properties. It's important to have good quality fats in your diet, whether they're from seeds or whether they're from fish. But you want things that are things that actually contain oil that you would normally eat. So for example, sunflower seed oil is one that I really like because I would eat sunflower seeds, and they have oil in them. Whereas corn oil, I kind of tend to avoid because I've eaten corn and it's not really oily. So I know that they're doing some weird stuff to get the oil out of it. They're using solvents to extract it and things like that. So I just tend to steer clear of that sort of thing. But good quality fats are good for decreasing inflammation and decreasing the body's tendency to produce inflammation in problematic amounts. And so the other area that where you find a lot of antioxidants are in brightly colored fruits and vegetables, because those same substances that color them tend to be things that our bodies use as antioxidants. So the purple in grapes, blackberries, blueberries, these are a group of substances called anthocyanins and proanthocyanidins, and they're really strong antioxidants. The orange colors are carotenoids, beta carotene being the most famous one, but there are lots of other ones as well. Zeaxanthin is a yellowish color, astaxanthin's a reddish color. These are all things that you can find naturally in brightly colored fruits and vegetables like watermelon and cantaloupe, squash, things like that. So getting as much of that sort of thing in your diet as you can is really helpful. And generally speaking, it's going to come along with a lot of other stuff like fiber that your body also needs, that also helps keep things running smoothly. So that's a really important thing to have in your system and a thing to have in your diet for promoting the longer term, slower, more baseline levels of inflammation from being too high. So if you're working with people at home who have injuries, you can use heat, you can use topical anti-inflammatories. If they have something like upset stomach or joint pain that's going on for a while, ginger is a really good one for that. Willow's a really good one for pain that's short term. Somebody maybe gets beat up in a boxing match or falls off their horse or something like that. There'll be a lot of inflammation associated with that, and that's a really good type of scenario to use salicylates, which is the category of herbs, category of substances that willow and violets and a lot of other anti-inflammatories fall under. So the green tea is really good for the longevity and the keeping the baseline inflammation down. the willow and ginger are good for the shorter term to medium term type of stuff. And, again, I think it's really important to realize that inflammation is uncomfortable, but it's not the enemy. It's a vital physiological process that sometimes can be severe enough that it's getting in the way of what people need to do. But where possible, rest is really helpful. If you have an area of your body that's experiencing a lot of inflammation, sometimes just not using that for a little while can be helpful. If it's, if you've hurt your knee, you don't want to walk on it. If you're having intestinal inflammation, sometimes fasting is helpful. Things like that, it's just giving your body some time to rest and making sure that you have good nutrition and adequate fluids is really a lot of the time the most important part. And then any kind of herbs and other interventions you might use would be in addition to that, supplementary to that. Just a second. Somebody asked, is heat beneficial for a gymnastics swell? Yeah, that's the sort of thing that heat is really good for. Ice baths for general health. Sometimes, that sort of thing, it's a little bit of a different process that's going on than icing an acute injury. And sometimes that is helpful. I mean, it's a bit shocking and dramatic for my tastes, but it does have its positive things that it does. And the last question is about autoimmune inflammation. So autoimmune inflammation happens when your body is over responding to especially connective tissue having some protein differences in it, or maybe just acting as though there were protein differences when there aren't. And by differences, I mean something like you might have damage to a joint and your body would swell that joint up and break down that damage. And that would be just sort of a normal thing to happen to an injured joint. In rheumatoid arthritis, your body acts as though there's damage to the joint, even when there doesn't seem to be, and has a big immune response to it and causes a bunch of swelling. And the trouble with swollen joints is they don't fit together properly with the bones. So eventually you get erosion, you get destruction of the tissue from moving them around. So sometimes in that situation, and that's not necessarily a great do-it-yourself at home type of thing, but in milder variants of it, ginger and willow can be helpful. When it's more severe, I tend to use stronger anti-inflammatories and things that suppress the immune system a little bit, which is, we'll eventually get into a little bit of that. But part of what goes on in your body when you have inflammation is that there are certain countermeasures that your body takes to keep the inflammation in check. And one of the main ones of those is cortisone, also known as cortisol, which is a steroid that's produced in your adrenal cortex and in a few other places in your body. And that decreases inflammation and decreases the immune responses that are part of inflammation. So there are herbs like wild yam, for instance, that kind of have some substances in them that aren't cortisone, but can kind of act similarly in the body, what you might call anti-inflammatory steroids. And those can be helpful in some cases of autoimmune inflammation. But I kind of feel like when it gets to that point, it's sort of, well, it's a little more advanced than to deal with than what we've talked about so far in this class. It is a really common scenario. A lot of people do have some degree of autoimmune inflammation, and we will, as we build our kind of arsenal of herbs that we use, our Materia medica, we'll get into that some more. But and there are some very safe things that you can do that help modulate the immune system. Shiitake mushroom is a food that is somewhat helpful for that, for instance. So that's something you might use in autoimmune inflammation. And heat can be helpful too, even if it's even if it's something like rheumatoid arthritis or inflammatory bowel syndrome or something like that, putting heat on the relevant area can still provide some relief. And so that can be an okay thing to do that's, simple enough for the level that we're at right now. All right. Somebody asked, is milk thistle good for inflammation and as an antioxidant? Milk thistle is somewhat of an antioxidant. Mostly I use milk thistle as a protective herb for the liver, and to help with the process of removing poisons from the body. So it does have some antioxidant effect, but that's not the main thing I would use it for. Okay, so that's something of a decent overview of inflammation, I hope. And like I said, inflammation is a normal process that's going on at a baseline level all the time. And increased inflammation is a part of just about any disease process, any illness process that would be happening in the body. So if somebody's got the flu, if somebody has got monkeypox, whatever, there's going to be inflammation involved in it. Diabetes, all kinds of diseases, cancer, there's usually inflammation involved. It's not necessarily what's causing the problem. It's often a result of some other primary problem, but it's almost always involved. And so because of that, knowing how to work with inflammation and getting practice working with inflammation is really important if you're wanting to be somebody who can take care of people who need help with their health. And it's something that it's good to start familiarizing yourself with fairly early on, and so that's why I brought it up as one of the first things like this that I'm talking about in terms of physiological processes. Usually, if you kind of pay attention to your body and feel into your body, you can usually feel that there's some inflammation going on in it all the time. And sometimes, even just working on dealing with those minor inflammatory processes can be helpful and can be a way to gain some experience too. So I wanted to talk about a couple of herbs again today. Since I've already mentioned ginger, I'm going to talk about ginger some. Ginger is, not something that usually grows where we are, but it's easy to find because it's widely sold, and it's got some good anti-inflammatory properties, and it's got good properties for strengthening the digestion. There's not a lot of contraindications for ginger. It's spicy, and some people that doesn't agree with, but it doesn't tend to pass through your digestive tract and remain spicy the way that cayenne does. So that's a positive thing. That's a plus as far as that goes, and something that has a really strong history of use, that people have been using for a long time, that a lot of people are familiar with, and that it actually has a large number of clinical trials backing up its use for a variety of different things, especially nausea and pain. And one of my favorite things to say about ginger, I repeat this frequently, but there was a long time ago where people used to think of the functioning of herbs as having to do with what they called signatures, and that herbs did what they did because they had some sort of physical characteristic that was reminiscent of part of the body. And
What? That's good. Okay, y'all quiet. I'm trying to listen to my class, okay?
Alien rubs cat.
Okay, all right, so all right. Okay, so anyway, ginger, people used to say that ginger worked the way that it did because the structure of the rhizome looks like it's made out of joints. And then now we feel like ginger works the way it does because of the substances that it contains, specifically that it's a cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitor, meaning that it interrupts one of the enzymes that's part of the signaling pathway that triggers inflammation. And but the way we use it hasn't changed, just the way we describe how we think it does what it does. Of course, not everyone really ever believed in the doctrine of signatures. It's just kind of one idea or one way of remembering what plants were useful for. So that's one anti-inflammatory that we talked about already, and that I just kind of wanted to go over a little bit. I had also mentioned, we talked about willow a little while ago. There's another herb that isn't as common here in the United States, more common in Europe, called meadowsweet. It's another type of similar to willow. It contains some similar substances. Spirea is the Latin name for this genus. Spirea ulmaria is the most commonly used one. And meadowsweet is a similar type of anti-inflammatory to what willow is. It can be used as an infusion, it can be used as a tincture, and it brings down inflammation. Violets are in the same category as well, and they bloom early in the spring, but you can find the leaves all year, and the leaves also contain the same substances. So the roots, the petals, the flowers, make a really nice purple remedy. You can make them into a tincture or a syrup. And they're very beautiful looking and often have a nice smell to them. But if you use the leaves, you get a brownish color remedy that looks a lot like every other tincture on your shelf, just kind of a tea color. But it has a lot of the same substances in it, and so it does work as well. There's a question of, does the native Spirea alba work the same way? Yeah, it basically works the same way. I haven't noticed that there's like a lot of difference in the different Spireas as far as how well they work. But Spirea ulmaria is kind of like, if you were going to buy it, that's probably what kind you would find. And if you were going to read up on it, that's probably what most of them would be discussing. But I haven't really noticed that there's a great deal of difference just in using them some between them. So in this same category of salicylates, the same category as willow and Spirea and violets, another one that I use very frequently is a local herb called wintergreen, Gaultheria. Now, if you try and look up stuff about wintergreen, you're probably going to mostly find stuff about wintergreen oil, which is the essential oil of wintergreen. And for a while, wintergreen oil was a very popular, and it still is. I mean, you can still buy it in places, but it was a very, very popular drug. The thing about wintergreen oil is, like other essential oils, you shouldn't take it internally. And if you do, it's fairly poisonous, and you can get too much of it, and it can cause, well, it can kill you, I suppose. It can cause gastric upset, bleeding, ulcers, things like that too. So anyway, like any essential oil, you shouldn't take it internally. But if you try and look up wintergreen, you're going to find all kinds of warnings saying, it's deadly poisonous, but it's always talking about the essential oil, or it's basing what it's saying on reports of the essential oil. The plant itself is somewhat environmentally sensitive. It grows in the woods. It's something that could easily be over harvested. So it's not like it's super rare or anything, but it's something that if you were to find a stand of it, picking one plant in 10 would be the most you would want to do with it. If I go to harvest it, I actually gather a lot less than one plant in 10, because there's plenty of it out there, and you can pick a leaf or two off of different plants until you've gotten a fair bit of it without actually even killing any of the plants. But I don't even like to touch more than about one plant in 20. And so anyway, it has been over harvested at some point. Habitat loss is more of an issue for it, I think, because it grows tends to grow on the ridges in the mountains here. And sometimes the same areas get logged because they're kind of easier to get to. But it's, and because of the kind of trees that grow on them, it's a really good remedy that I use a lot. And then another thing that's in the same category that's a very popular cultural remedy here in Kentucky is poplar buds, or cottonwood buds. Cottonwood and poplar are basically, cottonwood's a type of poplar. But the buds, the leaf buds, before they turn into leaves, are sticky, and they contain some resin that can be dissolved in alcohol or in oil. And that's the part that contains, or the easiest parts to use to get the anti-inflammatory substances out of it, which are in the same category, the same salicylate category. That's the chemical substance that makes them work, as the willow and violets and all these others. But it's a really good topical one to use too. And that topical remedy, which is traditionally it's made by cooking the buds of poplar in tallow, animal fat. If you don't really want to cook stuff in animal fat and rub animal fat on your skin, then you could do it in coconut oil and it would work just as well. But the idea is, you don't boil it or simmer it or anything. You get it warm and you leave it warm for hours. So you can do that maybe on a low temperature on a stove, which in the old days people had wood stoves, and it was easier to just keep something hot but not boiling for a long period of time if you had a low fire going in a wood stove all the time. But it's easy enough to do on the low setting on an electric stove. Or if you don't have an electric stove, you could even put it in a jar and put the jar somewhere out in the sun, like where it would get hot on a summer day. And it would cook some of this resiny stuff out into the oil, and then you can strain it and then let it cool, and it'll harden if you're using something like coconut oil that's solid at room temperature. Coconut oil or mutton tallow or whatever you happen to be using as your carrier oil. So this is a traditional Appalachian remedy. People call it balm of Gilead, which was the name of a remedy in the Bible that was a completely different plant. But it will work with a lot of different kinds of poplar trees. Populus balsamifera is kind of the one that is maybe well known for it, but it will work with just about any of them because they've all got some of the same salicylates in their leaf buds. So that's a whole big category of anti-inflammatories, the salicylate containing herbs. And we've talked about some of them before, and I just kind of wanted to give you a big rundown of all these different ones, not getting into quite the same depth that I usually do, but want to make sure that if I'm talking about inflammation, that I'm talking about things you can do about inflammation. So I got a question of, does using different types of poplar include liriodendron or just populus? Liriodendron has some anti-inflammatory stuff in it, but I don't really think it's the same stuff that's in populus. Liriodendron is a different tree that grows around here. So yeah, I would say just populus as far as that goes. Let's see. Oh, sweet birch is another one. I don't want to forget to mention that. Sweet birch is a type of birch tree that has the same flavor as wintergreen and as some of the violets, and those contain some good anti-inflammatory properties, and can be used for the same types of inflammation. And with all of these, well, not with all of them, there is a tendency with some of these herbs that they increase the fluidity of blood. They maybe make blood clot more slowly. So you don't want to do too much of them, but as a topical remedy with the ones that I've talked about using topically, or using a spoonful or so of the tincture or a cup or two of the tea every day is very safe, very well tolerated, and generally pretty effective for different types of pain and inflammation. Another herb that we've talked about previously that's good for certain types of inflammation is cayenne. Cayenne really can be used topically as a salve also. You can just put ground cayenne in oil and let it sit for a couple of weeks and then strain it, and then you can use that directly. This is exactly what you get from that process. And you can put this directly on areas of inflammation, and it actually kind of increases the heat, increases that capillary perfusion that I was talking about. So it's not exactly anti-inflammatory, but it is changing how the inflammation happens in a way that tends to result in less pain. Sort of like it's speeding up and burning out the inflammation process, kind of like, it's making the inflammation process burn itself out faster if it's something that's like a short-term type of inflammatory situation, like a muscle sprain. And you can use that and the poplar buds salve or the poplar bud extracts together, and get kind of heating and cooling together in the same substance. And so that's a good strategy for sore muscles and things like that. I want to make a couple of notes of things that I want to put in the comment section of this video so that I don't forget. So those are some very broad categories of anti-inflammatory substances. There are others as well. One thing that this is kind of more of a whole therapeutic category of herbs would be demulcents. But I want to talk about one particular demulcent that has some interesting properties as it relates to inflammation. And that is carrageen, sea moss. This stuff has really become popular in the recent years. It's kind of become a trendy sort of cure-all that lots of people make videos about. There was an herbalist named Dr. Sebi who died a few years ago, who was a big proponent of it. And I think a lot of its popularity kind of came about as a result of people talking about him. But this is a purple seaweed, and a lot of the time in the US it's referred to as Irish moss. It isn't moss, it's seaweed. And it grows in the Atlantic Ocean. This particular batch of it is from Ireland. This is Blanamara is the company, means flower of the sea, and they're a family business on Inishmore, which is an island off the west coast of Ireland. One of the Gaeltachts, one of the places where Irish is still spoken as the primary community language. And I first went to Inishmore to practice my Irish when I was a teenager, spent a summer there. And it's a really lovely place. It's very rocky, very rugged. But the sea around it is there's just always been a lot of subsistence fishing and foraging from the sea there. And so that's what these people do. And they've got, multiple generations working together to do it. So it's a really neat thing. And it's nice to know where it comes from and everything. Some of the sea moss that you would see if you buy it, which, I have no choice but to buy it where I live. I can't really go to the Atlantic Ocean and get it. But some of the sea moss that is sold in the United States is sort of a yellowish straw colored. And that's because it's been bleached in the sun. And if you buy it in Europe, they don't do that with it. So I've been getting it from these people, and I've been using a lot of it during the course of the pandemic because it's a really good anti-inflammatory and demulcent for the lungs. So a demulcent is an herb that is soothing. It's kind of like slimy and soothing types of herbs. There are a lot of examples of them. Aloe, you could call aloe a demulcent. And that's one that most people are familiar with, but there are some other ones like slippery elm or marshmallow that are taken internally that are also demulcent, and they tend to be soothing. So this can be used topically to soothe a burn or an itch or something like that. It can also be taken internally, which may be a topical application or it may not. So for example, if you're using it on a sore throat and it's soothing the sore throat, that is essentially a topical use. But I've been using it a lot for people with lung inflammation. And lung inflammation can manifest as asthma, shortness of breath, coughing, things like that, airway inflammation. And you're not inhaling the stuff into your airways. You're not drinking it into your lungs. At least you shouldn't. You're taking it into your bloodstream, and it's having an anti-inflammatory effect through the bloodstream, but more specifically working on the mucous membranes, in this case of the lungs. So it's a really a good herb to know about, a good soothing sort of thing. It's very much a home remedy, suitable as a home remedy. If you steep it in some water, you get this more of a broth than a tea, really, because it's a little bit salty and savory. But it's something that can be taken internally and is a little bit nutritive, a little bit soothing, helps with coughs, things like that, which, even when there's not a pandemic of a respiratory virus going on, there's always lots of call for home remedies that work on reactive airways, inflammation in the airways. So that's one of them. And lately, it's kind of my favorite one. It's not something I've always had a source for. So in other times during my practice, I haven't really used it very much. But in the last 6 or 7 years, I've been using it a lot and have really felt like I got a lot out of it. Felt like the people I've treated have gotten a lot out of having that available. So it's a good one to have, and it's a very good herb for the skin too. The same infusion that's made from it that can be taken internally for the mucous membranes is very softening and soothing to the skin. So it's a really good thing for all that. And the purple stuff in it is actually an antioxidant too. So it's useful kind of in the long term for its antioxidant properties, and those contribute a little bit to its anti-inflammatory effects.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
When you steep it in the water, like you held up a big chunk, do you just stick the whole chunk in the water? Do you like grind it down?
I don't grind it up. You could, but I don't think that it really helps that much. And I like to strain it off, and it's easier to strain off in big chunks. So usually I will just like put a few good sized pieces of it into a cup and pour boiling water over it and let it steep for 20 minutes or so.
Okay.
Let it steep a good long time. And you can even put it into a pot of water or bring a pot of water to boil, put it into the pot of water, and then let it sit for a long time, and then strain it off, and maybe even add more water. There's quite a bit of slime to it, so you can use it quite a bit. You can use it a couple times, make tea out of it 2 or maybe even 3 times before you've used up all of its of what's in it. So it's good stuff like that. It's kind of, the texture can be kind of gross or kind of weird for people to get used to, but it's very nourishing and very soothing.
So you can use like the big chunk more than once?
Yeah, you can probably use it twice or maybe even 3 times. So yeah, it's kind of like having aloe that you can rub on the inside of your body instead of just on your skin. Yeah, so it's good for anything that's kind of like burning or hurting inside the body. It's soothing.
When you post the video, will you link to that particular product that you held up?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, I can do that.
Awesome. I'll stop talking now.
Thanks. So appreciate your questions and comments. Yeah, so that's carrageen, which is also called Irish moss. Carragene's its name in Irish, but lately people have been using the name carrageen in English as well. So that's what I'm calling it from now on. It's especially since it isn't really moss. At least not in the modern understanding of the term moss, kind of maybe redefine that word from what it used to mean, but it's not what I think of as moss. It's seaweed, but it does grow on rocks, kind of like moss does. So that's a different example of an anti-inflammatory, and a different type of anti-inflammatory that's working through a completely different set of mechanisms. Would you ever eat the seaweed instead of making a tea? Yeah, you can totally do that. it gets soft when you cook it, and you can just chew it up and eat it. Some people are more, I feel like the texture of this seaweed is kind of a little bit weird compared to like sushi seaweed, but you can totally eat it. It's fine. It's fine to do it that way. Yeah, and you can put it in soup as a thickener. There's really no limit to what you can do with it. The interesting thing about this is that do all seaweeds have similar properties? I would say that most, if not all, seaweeds contain some of the same demulcent properties. This one contains a lot of demulcent stuff, much more so than kelp does, for instance, even though they both do have some. So similar properties, but not necessarily to the same degree. Interestingly, though, if you put this on an open wound, it can actually make it swell more if you poultice it on an open wound. And people have used the starch from this carrageenan, which is also used as a thickener in foods, but people have used that in a laboratory setting to induce inflammation in lab animals, which is, kind of an awful thing to do. But because it draws water to itself, it can be used as a way of triggering swelling, which then the swelling causes the rest of the inflammatory process to happen around it. So sometimes people who aren't very familiar with its use will think that it's going to cause inflammation, but except outside of a very narrow range of applications, it really doesn't. It tends to soothe inflammation. If you did have a non-healing wound and you poultice the carrageenan on it, sometimes it will make it get a little more inflamed temporarily, but that's good because it's the body actually having a response to the area when it hasn't been, and it needs to be. So carrageenan, carrageen moss is a good type of anti-inflammatory that's completely different from the type of anti-inflammatory that willow is, or the type of anti-inflammatory that ginger and cayenne are through being spicy. I wanted to talk about one plant that is another anti-inflammatory. And again, this is not necessarily the most widely commercially available plant, but it is easy to grow, and it's common where I live and common in a lot of parts of the United States. And this is butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. And this doesn't necessarily apply to other types of milkweed, other members of the genus Asclepias, because they have some different substances in them. But this particular plant contains an aromatic root, and the root contains some different types of anti-inflammatory substances, as well as some other properties. But it contains some plant steroids, sterols that are strong anti-inflammatories, but they're fairly safe to use. The scientific name again is Asclepias tuberosa. Asclepius is named after an ancient Greek god of healing, or well, he's half god, half nymph. Sometimes he's considered a demigod, but a character from Greek mythology who was a healer, and who Hippocrates and Hippocrates' students and their school of medicine kind of traced their lineage to this character, Asclepius. They said, that they had received their teachings in a long line of succession from him. And so modern medicine kind of comes, or fashioned itself in the image of Hippocrates' school of teaching. And Hippocrates came from, or fashioned himself in the image of this character from mythology, Asclepius. So the plant's called Asclepias tuberosa. It's sort of an orange flowered milkweed. Butterfly weed is what I call it in plain English. And some people call it pleurisy root, which pleurisy isn't really a word we use very much anymore. But pleurisy is like inflammation of the mucous membranes around the lungs. So this is a plant that contains some good, strong anti-inflammatory substances. It's not only for inflammation in the lungs, although it's aromatic, so it will also break up congestion. But those same aromatic substances that are in it help it to get where it's going in the body by opening up the circulation. And it is a stronger anti-inflammatory than willow. It's kind of, I would say, on a different level from willow, but it's safe enough that I feel like it's okay to talk about here. It's not something that tends to cause problems. I suppose there would be a level at which it would. I wouldn't really use this herb because steroids interfere with metabolism and the immune system. I wouldn't tend to use this herb for more than a few days at a time until you get to be a lot more experienced and more used to dealing with more severe things. But using it for 5 days is perfectly, or as nearly perfectly safe as anything is very safe. And this can be good for if somebody is having inflammation of a sort that comes on in flares. Like some people will have an issue like arthritis or psoriasis or something like that, where there's inflammation that remits and flares up. So sometimes, maybe somebody will have no problem with an inflammatory issue for a while, and then they'll have a lot of inflammation. So this is a good thing for interrupting those flare-ups. And it's a good thing for dealing with any kind of inflammation that has come up suddenly and that you want to put down suddenly. So my favorite way of making this into a remedy is as a tincture. You can also make it into a decoction. We haven't really talked about decoctions yet, but a simple tincture like what we talked about before is a pretty good way of making it. And it's a good, stronger type of anti-inflammatory than what willow and violets and so forth are. So somebody asks, does this help with fibromyalgia and other can it help with fibromyalgia and other chronic pain syndromes? Yes, it can, especially if there's something like a new flare-up where it's suddenly gotten a lot worse. That would be a reasonable time to use this. If it's something where things are sort of at a baseline, maybe it would help to use it for a few days, but I wouldn't at this point recommend using it for like long periods of time. So, another question that I got was, what would you suggest for someone with osteoarthritis? So with osteoarthritis, I really like heat, and I really like the spicier anti-inflammatories like ginger, and maybe that along with something soothing like the carrageen or another demulcent type herb. But especially heat and spicy things like ginger, or turmeric is also a good one for that, and it's a similar substance to ginger. So ginger and turmeric are good. And then diet is really important with osteoarthritis. You want to make sure that you're getting enough protein in your diet that you're going to have the ability to repair those tissues, because they're made out of protein, and they're being worn down faster than they're being replaced. So osteoarthritis is essentially just sort of inflammation to the joints that results from long-term wear and tear of having had a skeleton for a long time. And the real danger with osteoarthritis is that, it's painful, but one of the things that can easily go wrong with osteoarthritis is that you have to keep moving because that's just life. And then because your joints are swollen, they're not fitting together properly. And that causes destruction of the joints, which causes more inflammation. So sometimes doing a strong dose of a bunch of different anti-inflammatories for a few days can really help to break that cycle. But there are things like making sure you have shoes that have good shock absorption can be a huge quality of life issue for somebody with a huge quality of life improvement for somebody with osteoarthritis. And that's something that often gets overlooked. It can make a difference between feeling completely hobbled at the end of the day and being just a little bit sore, for instance. Making sure you're getting good fats, making sure you're getting adequate level of protein, and then warmth on any joints that are especially badly affected, and ginger as an anti-inflammatory are all good things that I feel like we've talked about so far in this course that are applicable to that situation. Garlic sometimes helps as well. It's a different type of, it contains some sulfur compounds, which can be helpful to the joints. And then the topical anti-inflammatories that I talked about, those can be helpful as well in osteoarthritis.
Hey, Andrew.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who was asking me that question, but I do have a little thing to add if it's okay. From my personal experiences in dealing with chronic inflammation, the best thing I have found that would be useful to anyone trying to treat someone like that probably has been removing all sugar from my life. Absolutely all sugar. That has been the most helpful thing that I have done and seen a huge improvement so fast.
Yeah, and that's if you have a lot of sugar in your diet, or really even any of it, refined sugar, sometimes that makes a huge difference. It doesn't for everybody, but for some people it really does, because your body's ability to metabolize sugar is really dependent on your endocrine system and your energy processing system in your body, which is the same system that produces a lot of your anti-inflammatory substances. So, sugar for some people can be a huge trigger for inflammation. Also, sometimes eliminating other things from the diet are helpful for some people, especially grains like corn.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was gonna say. Like,
corn
I
and
totally
wheat make a big difference for
yes.
some people. So yeah, I mean, it can be really involved. It can be quite a complicated journey trying to track down the triggers for inflammation in a particular person, and they differ a lot from one person to the next. But sugar is a big one, and it's something that that we don't really need. You don't really have to have any refined sugar in your diet. You do have to have some sort of sources of various other nutrients, but refined sugar is kind of not really something that people are made to be able to metabolize exactly.
Right.
I mean, our bodies gobble it right up because it's a lot of calories and stuff. But we're made to eat fruit. We're not really made to eat bags of sugar, fizzy drinks with sugar in them and things like that. There was another question about whether any of this would interact with opioids, with pain meds. They really won't. They're kind of on a completely different track, because things like that aren't really anti-inflammatory. They're just kind of changing your pain response, your pain perception in your nervous system, but they're not really interacting with the process of inflammation at all. Now, using the willow type anti-inflammatories, that would be like the willow, the poplar, the wintergreen, the violets, along with ibuprofen or aspirin, can be like taking a larger dose of any one of them, because there's a certain limit to how much of those types of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory things that your body is going to be able to process. So, if you're doing ibuprofen, you probably don't want to do willow and ibuprofen. You probably want to try one or the other, or, you know, at least not do the maximum dose of either one. Maybe, you know, if somebody were to take willow in the afternoon instead of taking their afternoon dose of ibuprofen, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but you wouldn't want to take a full dose of ibuprofen and then add willow on top of that, or the maximum dose of ibuprofen and then add willow on top of that, because that might upset your stomach and might cause some could cause some other problems like bleeding. I haven't ever actually seen it cause that, but it's you know, out of an abundance of caution, I would suspect that it might be capable of causing such a thing. So yeah, so that's something to be aware of. And then with the Asclepius, that's not in that same category. It's kind of a different type of thing, and you don't really have to worry as much about it interacting with the other things, because it has a totally different set of physiological processes that it's working through. Same with the ginger. So yeah, for the most part, most of these things aren't going to cause a lot of problems or interactions or anything like that. And with the Asclepius, the butterfly weed, I've been using that a lot lately for I've been using it a fair bit for people with after effects of COVID, which tends to be inflammatory in different ways. In the past, I've also used it for inflammatory after effects of other things, and I still do. For example, Lyme disease or Epstein-Barr virus. Sometimes they have a lot of you know, post-acute inflammatory issues, and so it can be helpful with that. But again, I would say, especially early on in your process of gaining experience with herbs, that would be an herb that you would want to use for maybe, you know, 1 to 5 days, rather than something you would want to be using as consistently or be using all the time, just because it can perhaps immune function and metabolism a little bit, which is not a big deal if you're doing it for a few days, but might become more of an issue if you were doing it for months at a time or something like that. All right. Any other questions? Let's see. All right, so I'm going to, it will probably be late tonight or early tomorrow before I get a chance to upload the video, but I'm going to include some links and recipes in the comments to that. Just a few simple things. All right. Well, that's about all I have for today. So thank you all for coming. And if you think of any questions, feel free to let me know, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you
Can I ask one more? Can I ask one more question about the butterfly weed?
Yeah.
Can it help with MS also?
It can help with the inflammatory parts of MS. So the inflammation parts of MS, there's some, you know, neurodegenerative stuff where the nervous system is being damaged that it won't really directly help with, but it will help with quelling the inflammation and, you know, maybe reducing the any kind of a flare up that's happening in the moment. So
But
yeah,
there's probably, is there other herbs that would be better for that kind of condition?
probably, yeah. I mean, it would depend. It would differ from person to person, but yeah, there are other herbs that would be like better for protecting and restoring the nervous system and the myelin sheath around the nerves and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Yeah. All right. Any other questions before I go? Oh yeah, let's see. Can you use the wild ginger that grows around here the same as the ginger you find in stores? No, it's a totally different plant. It has a little bit of a similar taste and a related name, but it's not really the same thing at all. So I wouldn't try using it as a direct substitute for wild ginger. It does have its own medicinal properties, but it's not really anti-inflammatory in the same way that ginger, the actual ginger is. It's more like it induces sweating, and it can be used topically to help burns to heal faster. All right. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and I will. Yeah, I'll get this posted as soon as I'm able to, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.